Hi there, and welcome to the Digital Download, the State of Content Moderation webinar presented by the Meyer Foundation. My name is Taylor Ansell, and I am thrilled to be joined by a panel of industry leaders who are experts in their fields. Today's discussion will focus on the role of content moderation as it relates to the current state of affairs, the explosion of artificial intelligence, and the implications it presents with regard to mental health. So, what exactly is content moderation? Content moderation is the process of monitoring, reviewing, and managing user-generated content on online platforms to ensure it complies with community guidelines, legal regulations, and ethical standards. This moderation can be carried out by humans, automated tools, or a combination of both. So, here to help us parse out what exactly this means, I'm excited to welcome our panelists and invite them to introduce themselves. Tina, let's start with you.
Hi, my name is Tina Meyer, and I am the founder and executive director of the Meyer Foundation. I founded the foundation in 2007 after my daughter Megan took her own life. She was cyberbullied by an adult neighbor pretending to be a boy on MySpace. Our mission is to support and inspire actions to end bullying, cyberbullying, and suicide. From that time, I've traveled around the country speaking to students in public schools, private, suburban, rural schools, students of all ages, talking about these issues of internet safety, cyberbullying, and how to be able to be online and be able to enjoy being online, and what to do when they are struggling, what to do when hateful things are being said, how to report it, who to talk to. And that is why I'm grateful to have this discussion and conversation here today.
Hi there, my name is Sarah T. Roberts, and I'm a professor and researcher at UCLA, the co-founder and director of the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry at UCLA, and an expert in content moderation of social media. But what I quickly learned in my early research was that, in fact, no firm in its right mind would ever cede total control of its branded site or platform to users without any way of doing any intervention. And so once I learned that, I really reframed my thinking around this practice of content moderation as being one of primarily brand management, with unfortunately user protection and user safety really coming as a secondary or an afterthought to that primary practice of brand management. The second piece of my research was framed around the implications of content moderation as it was being undertaken, particularly in those early days, largely by human workers. As our host mentioned, at this point in time, we largely have a content moderation landscape on the largest platforms that has a large element of automation, and that certainly has human beings and computational content moderation practices working in tandem and in concert with each other. But nonetheless, humans remain a vital part of that infrastructure. And it turns out that just as that material that is perhaps removed or rescinded from platforms as being inappropriate or too violent or too gory or in other ways not fit for consumption by consumers, it is in fact very difficult for those human beings who adjudicate that material to experience and deal with it day in and day out. And so my primary concern over the years has really been about worker welfare, but any discussion of that gets us very quickly into a conversation about the larger content moderation landscape, the role and responsibilities that platforms have, roles and responsibilities of other parties, and how we are collectively meeting or failing to meet the needs of some of our most vulnerable participants in the social media landscape, such as was just mentioned, unfortunately, in the story of the young woman who took her own life after being heinously bullied.
My name is Bar Lalani, and I'm currently the Global Vice President of Trust and Safety Policy here at Teleperformance. I work with a number of platforms across social media, gaming, dating, e-commerce, and other sectors on their policy enforcement, as well as partnerships, working with other parts of the industry, with civil society, academia, as well as international organizations. I also oversee our recently launched Trust and Safety Advisory Council for Teleperformance, which Sarah is a member of, as well as a number of other experts across both the industry and nonprofits on their engagement with the content moderation industry. Previously, I was with the World Economic Forum, where I launched the Global Coalition for Digital Safety, working with regulators, industry, academia, and civil society on solutions and policies to improve online safety globally.
Great, thank you, panelists. As you can see, we have rounded up the best of the best. So on that note, let's get started. What is the current state of content moderation, and can you tell us how we got here? Sarah, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, it's a great question to kind of frame up our discussion, and I'll try to be as concise as I can to fill in the blanks of, really the last coming on 2 decades of the evolution of what has turned into an industry unto itself. So essentially, as I indicated in my opening remarks, content moderation was for most of the major platforms, and unfortunately, I think it's fair to say even continues today for newly launched platforms in the social media space, an afterthought. And what I mean by that is that many of the social products that are in the space had a sense that they were sort of opening a Pandora's box, if you will, with regard to what it meant to make their primary objective the solicitation of user-generated content from essentially anyone in the world. Unvetted parties, pretty much anybody could upload anything at any time. And the kind of the going orientation towards that was we want all the content we can get, because essentially that is the stock and trade of social media firms, and we'll sort out the problems on the other side. Well, given the popularity and given the incredible, unprecedented growth alongside the kinds of technological innovations that have also been part and parcel of the last decade and a half. And by that, I mean, simply just the increase in bandwidth, the expectation that we have Wi-Fi or cellular connectivity pretty much everywhere we go, the fact that we have these smartphones in our pocket that can produce cinematic quality video, et cetera. The amount of content that was created was, beyond anybody's wildest expectations. And unfortunately, what we're really contending with when we're talking about content, which is sort of a mushy word, in my opinion. It's sort of a catch-all term. What we're really talking about is the gamut of human behavior and self-expression. And that can be some of the very best, most lovely types of human interactions that we could imagine, or, kind of the rabbit hole I tend to fall down into on social media, cute animal videos, fairly innocuous, really bring people a lot of joy and smiles. Unfortunately, all the way to the very worst types of behavior that we could even possibly imagine, and sometimes that we wouldn't have even been able to imagine or fathom prior to this industry springing forward. And so what happened for the social media firms was that they very quickly realized that in order to appeal to the largest number of people around the globe that they could, and in so doing, really draw those advertising partners who are their primary customers, let us not forget, that they had to have a mechanism by which to ensure those advertisers that they would be engaging with their products and services in an environment that wasn't horrific. And prior to really getting an organized practice around content moderation, which meant establishing clear-cut policies, testing those in production settings very early on, working with those industry partners and advertising partners about what was acceptable and not acceptable, working within the legal bounds of the countries in which they were operating. Many concerns were suddenly on the table for companies that were, I think we can all agree, fairly ill-equipped to handle them. And so there was a lot of being caught on the back foot and a need to very quickly scale up a workforce, particularly in the early days when computation was just not up to the task of providing the kinds of adjudication that goes into content moderation, which is frankly, sometimes very clear cut when we think about maybe like spam content or things that are maybe lower risk in terms of if users are exposed to it. So it's irritating or annoying to see some kind of spam, but it goes all the way to the very other side of that, where people could be exposed to violent, horrific material that you wish you could erase from your brain, material that exposure to could cause harm. And we've heard about even some of those harms, and we're going to hear more about that as we go through our discussion. Those kinds of decisions, particularly early on, required human beings, and they required human beings to understand how to properly implement those policies and how to adjudicate in a way where the line that was being struck was very fine. Where we are today is that we know that social media is huge. Meta, Google, TikTok, all of these products are massive, and their market share is immense. The kinds of revenue they generate is incredible. The kinds of results they produce on Wall Street, also incredible. And in relation to that, the responsibility on the firms has also grown. What most of them have done, as they sort of experimented with different models and how to kind of address this dire need for meeting the adjudication that had to go on, often started off by user reports about abusive content or material that users would come across and think something was wrong with. They had to grow a workforce very quickly who could be trained and who could be deployed in a production environment. And this was in a context where these tech firms that are in social media often considered themselves to be very lean with regard to the number of employees that were engaged directly by those firms. So when we think about a company like Meta, given its global size and impact, the number of direct employees is actually fairly small. Same for the former Twitter. Same for any of these other companies that you care to name. So what happened was they turned to a lot of third-party firms who were often already in the labor provision space or provide the labor, the space of providing services, kind of as a third-party mechanism to firms. Maybe they were already providing other kinds of outsourced tasks, and they moved into this content moderation space, or maybe they became an entity in the industry strictly on the basis of the need of content moderation. Both things were happening. But what has happened in these in most recent years for the major firms is that they've really kind of settled on this model of having all of their direct employees kind of be focused on the tech, the policy development, marketing, other kinds of concerns, and that content moderation work has gone to these third-party firms. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about that from at least one of the other colleagues on this webinar. So I don't want to say too much more about that, but that kind of brings us up to the present of where we are today. And where that puts us with regard to numbers is actually a massive workforce, globalized around the world, working 24/7 to address the need for content moderation. Again, in conjunction with computation, in conjunction with what we might think of as automated kinds of content moderation activity. But those humans are still essential. And there's really no foreseeable moment when we would think of them kind of being outside of the system. So we're up into, hundreds of thousands of people around the world doing this work. on all our behalf at this point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for those thoughts. I want to co-sign the cute animal bit in particular, so thank you for bringing that up. Farah and Tina, is there anything you want to add to what Sarah said?
I would love to just jump in and add some thoughts to Sarah's really great overview. As the content moderation industry has evolved, we've kind of come to see more as to the effectiveness of it, right? And there was a recent study actually published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that was looking to assess the impact of the Digital Services Act in Europe that has found moderation is indeed effective in reducing harm, right? And so, of course, the level of harm reduction depends on the time taken for removal and how quickly that sort of content spreads on the platform. But more and more, we're finding research and assessments that are finding the effectiveness of content moderation. So I think the sort of conversation has moved towards, do we need to moderate, to how do we moderate effectively, right? Are violating pieces of content being removed proactively? How long is it taking to action user reports? What is the rate of user appeals? Are there quick and effective mechanisms for redress or escalation channels for people who disagree with the content moderation decisions? Are policies available in all languages for markets where the platform is active? And do platforms have the same language coverage in terms of moderation capacity for non-English content? So these are the types of questions that I think as the content moderation space evolves that are starting to come more to the surface, and we're seeing a mix of, regulatory, proposals and industry efforts to try and address some of the challenges and opportunities here.
Tina, anything to add there?
Yes, I think, where I have the ability to add is our foundation gets the families that call, right? So it's the, ground zero when the child is using a social media site. And, we know that whatever that content may be, it could be inappropriate. It could be very hurtful, but it may not violate the terms of service, right? And so that's, I think, the hardest part is trying to get parents to understand, educators to understand, and then kids, there's no possible way for them to understand that, well, it has to go through all these steps and it may take several months for us to find out. But in the meantime, yes, those things are hurtful, but the platform does not feel that it violates their terms of service. And so that's where we really get into that space of all of the great things that you guys are doing and all of the things to protect us. But then when it filters down, is it actually working? And that's where we're seeing that in content moderation, it's a big struggle. It's a struggle for schools to be able to deal with the situations that are happening. It's a true struggle for parents because anytime somebody says something negative about their child, they want it down. And what we're also seeing is kids are very, very smart. So they're not using a specific child's name or tagging it to their account. What they're doing is they're talking about them, but in a way that it's so subtle, you wouldn't know that they were talking about another child. So then for a content moderator, how do they know if they say, oh, well, it's a song lyric, or I'm just talking about this or talking about that. And so what we have a lot of times is families are frustrated. Schools say, well, there's nothing we can do. We don't have any control over it. And kids say, well, see, nobody cares. And so it's really what we try to do is give them clear guidelines of the steps of what we'll be taking so that they're not surprised. And then giving them ideas to think about, like, if it does not come down, what are some things that can be done, right? Or what are some things that we can discuss with the child? Because the whole talking about, the content moderation, they don't really understand those words. They only understand what is being said about them. It is so hurtful. And that's where our foundation really tries to to step it down into their level, to talk to them about it and give them some steps. And so while I see that there are constantly things that are happening to try to improve, we still need to filter it down from those social media sites. It still needs to be filtered down for parents. It still needs to be filtered down very easily for kids to understand. And that's what I think we're definitely missing, those pieces.
Appreciate all of that. Farah, I want to go back to you for the next question. With the rapid advancement of digital technologies, we've seen the explosion of artificial intelligence. What implications does that artificial intelligence have on content moderation, both in negative and frankly positive ways?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I want to start with the positive because I think there is a lot of positive here, right? When it comes to removing harmful content, the more that's automated and the less that a human has to review and the impact on people, right? At the same time, good AI and automation still has a human review and human in the loop process. But in general, AI and other technologies have really helped with proactive removal, right? Technology can now proactively remove anywhere from between 97 to 99% of violent and graphic content, of course, depending on the specific technology. But in other areas, it still requires more investment and more training. So in areas such as hate and harassment, this is very difficult. This requires more context. And so the proactive removal rate can drop down to as much as, 65 to 85%. And there's a lot of nuanced understanding and contextual review by people to get it right. At the same time, when we look at areas like child sexual abuse material, AI has been incredibly helpful in detecting new CSAM. For example, AI classifiers have been developed by many of the large platforms and some nonprofits as well to detect new CSAM. So there's a big benefit from AI. There are, however, a number of challenges that AI poses. So I want to lay out just a few. One is we're seeing a lot of discussion right now, right, around large language models and generative AI. And the first challenge really is the sheer volume of net new harmful and illegal content that is and is going to be created through generative AI. We have already seen the proliferation of AI-generated non-consensual intimate images, videos, or deepfake porn, sometimes referred to. And there's also people that are abusing existing LLMs by prompting in different languages, using different terminology, or using multiple prompts to try and circumvent the safeguards that the model builders have tried to embed. And unfortunately, people are already using open source AI models to generate CSAM, which is really why strong guardrails are needed for this technology. The second main challenge I want to touch on is the challenge of detection, right? So there's a lot of new content that's being created, but the challenge is really distinguishing AI versus human generated content. While some AI detection tools are good in specific use cases, it's much more difficult in other cases. So, there are going to be new investments in tools, processes, and mechanisms to try and differentiate between AI and human-generated content. And you can see why that would be important in the case of, say, child sexual abuse material, where it might be reported and then impact the prioritization of, say, law enforcement efforts for child rescue. There are initiatives like the Content Authenticity Initiative and others that are working on sort of understanding the source of content and content provenance signals, discussing potentially the use of watermarks and other tools out there to try and differentiate and sort of mark AI-generated content, but it's still early days, and it's sort of a battle between bad actors trying to, circumvent those guardrails and the content provenance signals that some companies are trying to embed now. And lastly, I'll just touch on the content moderation specifically. So with AI, it's of course advancing and going to further eliminate or at least reduce the need for human moderation, but there are some challenges to be aware of with this, right? The first is linguistic and cultural context. Large language models are trained from existing content on the internet, so they're skewed towards English content and sort of communities that have access to the internet, which are usually the more developed and sort of richer communities. So when using AI or Gen AI for content moderation, there is a risk of sort of further marginalizing vulnerable communities when used for moderation at scale.
Farah, I'm gonna stop
And
you
because
right
the
there
data
really
set,
quickly, if you
oh,
don't mind. Sorry, your
yes,
audio was cutting out a little bit on the last 2 points that you made. Do you think that you could
okay,
just go back for us and restart? It happened when you made your second negative point about AI.
okay. So that was, was that the detection piece?
Yes. We're gonna try to let it go for a little bit, but then your audio completely cut out. So I figured while we're stopping, let's try to redo that second part as well.
Really good, though.
It was really great. I felt so bad cutting you off. I'm so sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. It's okay. Don't worry. Okay, I'm gonna start from the detection piece then.
Perfect. Thank you.
So the second challenge that we're seeing is that it's really difficult to distinguish between AI and human-generated content. While there are some AI detection tools that are good in specific use cases, they're not so great in others. So the problem is really around finding this inauthentic or AI-generated content and improving those tools to try and enforce the policies that platforms have across their harm types. So the second challenge when it comes to AI for moderation is really the difficulty in distinguishing AI versus human-generated content. And we're already seeing this become an issue when trying to clean up platforms. So there are AI detection tools that exist, and some are better than others, and they're better in different use cases. But you can see this becoming an issue, right, when it comes to, for example, material like child sexual abuse material, where there is a real downstream impact for understanding whether it is AI generated or involves real children, because that can, in the end, impact law enforcement prioritization of real children's rescue. So it is a critical aspect in terms of detecting AI generated content. And there are companies that are working on this, as well as initiatives like the Content Authenticity Initiative that are working on sort of understanding the source of content and trying to embed content provenance signals into AI generated content so that we can start to understand the source of AI generated content. So this is an active problem that's currently being worked on. Lastly, I want to touch on the moderation piece of it. And it's definitely true that advancements in AI are going to further eliminate the need for human moderation, or at least reduce it in some way, so that humans can focus on, say, more complex policy areas. But there are some challenges with using AI for moderation. And the first is linguistic and cultural context. Large language models are trained from the existing content on the internet, so they are skewed in terms of English content, and may fail to capture some of the language and norms of countries that people who have less access to the internet and therefore a smaller linguistic footprint online. And so that can pose some challenges, right, when it comes to moderation, as it could further marginalize vulnerable communities when used for moderation at scale. Because the data sets are so large, it's also difficult to kind of find these embedded biases and weed these out. So while overall AI may be able to moderate a lot of content at scale, we do need to be mindful of these limitations or risks, especially in policy areas such as hate speech or harassment that are nuanced and in geographic regions that are non-Western and European. And we'll also need some more people to red team these models themselves, which have which sometimes do produce harmful content. So that will require some more human oversight.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Fair. I'm going to open it up. Yeah, Sarah, I know you're chomping at the bit. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I thought that was, I totally concur with everything that was said, and appreciate all that nuance that was introduced. I think um, 2 points that I would underline from my perspective as more of a um, more external to industry, but someone who is keenly aware and interested in what's going on within it. The first issue is the way in which the large language model corpus is generated, and Farah just touched on that and made a key point, which is that the way that at this moment in time those corpora are generated is by scraping the internet. Now we all know that the internet is the very best source of information and has everybody behaving at their very best at all times, right? Of course not, right? And so that's like, that's problem number one. I mean, there's an old adage in programming which says garbage in, garbage out, meaning that your result is only going to be as good as, say, the data set that you start with. And so when we think about kind of sourcing our models corpus from places like Reddit, I mean, for many of us that strikes fear into our very hearts because we've experienced as users ourselves the kind of toxicity that can result in those very spaces. So, what is the solution then um, for this conundrum of these tools requiring these massive data sets, essentially these massive corpora, in order to do the very kind of AI moderation that can kind of take us on a leap forward in this industry? Well, we have to look back to our humans in the loop, and where we've seen over the years this kind of legion of human beings at the production level, decision making in real time around content. What these LLM based AI tools and other kinds of AI that are being introduced really are doing, in my opinion, is sort of moving that human intervention somewhere else into the production chain. And so we're seeing human activity and engagement happening much earlier on in the process rather than being at that moment of decision making or in that kind of like real time production environment. The humans are moving into um, dealing with that very corpus, that large language model, and maybe constructing other types of models that work in conjunction with that large language model to understand what ought to not be a part of the model. So, in other words, they are tasked with going through that massive corpus sourced from the internet to look for all the bad stuff, essentially, and remove it. Now, that doesn't get us too far away from the problem for many human content moderators that they will themselves volunteer as the primary difficulty of their role, which is that exposure to difficult content, which for me is kind of a core concern. And yet, I really can't fully advocate for turning to AI tools at the expense of human judgment, because to date, human judgment is much more sophisticated. It's much better at certain kinds of decision making than our AI tools are in some critical key cases. And as Farah indicated, we are lacking collectively in the kinds of culturally and linguistically appropriate um, corpora that would even allow for AI to really successfully do the work uh, for some other global um, constituencies beyond, people who are using American English, for example, or North American English. And the one other thing I'll just say about AI and its tools is that um, those tools are only as good as they're programmed to be. And they're only going to make the decisions that they are kind of envision to make. And the one thing about humans who do this work is that, um, this is exceptional, but at times they are able to make decisions that might fall out of, uh, essentially the flowchart logic that they are made to follow as they enact and enforce policy. And that can actually be a net benefit. That can be a net good for all of us at the end of the day. I don't want to suggest that happens so often that it's a phenomenon at this point that is sort of a saving grace. But I think there's something to be said to have that kind of human intervention in the context of human self-expression. That's actually what we're looking at and what we're considering. Now, the real problem here that I think we're sort of skirting around, because I think none of us has the solution on this webinar, is the volume of material. It's the scale, right? That's really the issue. There is no realistic possibility where let's say we could eliminate the problem of humans being harmed by exposure to content. Let's say we could wave a magic wand and that were no longer a problem. We still would be at pains to have a workforce that could match the amount of content that comes through these social media platforms. And that is why computational tools are so important. And we're still only dealing with a fraction of the material at some level that needs to be adjudicated. So, we're left with a set of problems that don't have easy solutions. Things like how do we decide where the resources go, the relative impact of some material versus others. So again, even pornographic material involving adults is many measures lower harm, let's say, than what we've discussed as child sexual abuse material circulating online. So there are all these sorts of considerations that are so complex and nuanced, and coming up with solutions or means to address these issues, it's a Sisyphean task in many ways, and it's a set of problems that really don't have a clear-cut solution. There's never going to be a point in time, in other words, where we can sort of wash our hands of this and say we've solved content moderation. An individual who's employed by Meta as a computer scientist made that claim at some point in the last couple of years on Twitter, that Meta had quote unquote solved content moderation, and it was all I could do to control myself in the face of that claim. There's no such thing unless you've suddenly figured out how to make people stop harming each other, how to make people behave, how to ask people to respect others' humanity. And we fundamentally can't seem to solve that in everyday life, much less online. But that having been said, the last comment I want to make on that is that we can't let the platforms off the hook here. We can't just kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, these are fundamental problems of human nature that have existed since time immemorial. Because although that is true to a certain extent, what we have to think about is the impetus for the behaviors that are going on online. And one of the primary ones is the fact simply that this material has been monetized and commoditized, so that our human interaction, our human interpersonal relationships, our behavior, our self-expression doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't happen with no consequence. And for the firms, it's actually currency. So that's one of the vectors that I think creates many of the complexities here. The other one is that firms are developing policies internally, and in the past years, certainly the European Union, member states within the European Union, the United Kingdom, all kinds of places all around the world have been pushing back with demands about how they would like to see content moderation undertaken with regard to their sovereign laws. But for the most part, this industry grew up and these practices grew up based on internal policy. And those policies, to Tina's point, don't always make sense to lay people, to regular folks. They're not the sorts of logics that we would necessarily think of, like oh, we see something, it's obviously intended to bully and harass a young person, but it skirts around the rules just so where by the firm's own policy, no action can be taken. Um, that's a hard pill to swallow when you know that you're being targeted or you're somebody you love is being targeted. But the way the policies operate within the firms don't seem to be able to address that. And so we have also a disconnect between the logics of the firms and how they are doing business and the point of them soliciting all this user generated content in the first place, and sort of how maybe we've been socialized in our own communities or our own families and our expectations um, that we might have towards each other or that we might believe the firms have to us. That's a social contract that we imagine that just might not exist in the ways that we think about. And that becomes very challenging when folks face these situations that are very harmful and hurtful. So I'll just throw all that food for thought in, and it's very complex.